Okay. Let's just start out. John, talk a little bit about your family. Where you were born, members of your family.
Grew up in Southwest Atlanta, which is Cascade Heights, and went to E.L. Conley Elementary School, and went to Southwest High School, now Southwest DeKalb, Southwest Atlanta. And at that time, there were probably 10 to 12 high schools in the city of Atlanta, and then went on to Georgia Tech. So I tell people I'm maybe as native as anybody could possibly be that lives here in Atlanta.
Well, you were well known for starting your own company. Tell me a little bit about your experiences before you got to that point.
Went to Georgia Tech. Went to school early, and I got out of school when I was either 19 or 20. Did a stint in the Army National Guard. Went to work for Georgia Power Company, calling on developers, and was what was called then a residential sales engineer. Actually, it's when I met Johnny Isaacson. At that time, he was working, had just started with Northside, and I just started with Georgia Power Company, and we developed a great friendship that we've had ever since. But after calling on developers, I felt like that maybe that's something I could do myself, and probably at 25 or 26, 22, I started working as in the real estate industry, apartments, and was involved in a community called Raleigh Square, which was the first big apartment project built north of 285 in Sandy Springs, and built a lot of apartments. By the time I was 25, I probably was involved in 10,000, 15,000 apartments, and at 26 years old, I said, well, I can do it on my own. I started a company called Post Properties, and after not too many years, we moved the home office to Park Air. Most people don't remember that Park Air was an airfield, and we bought it and redeveloped it into condos, shopping centers, etc., and then moved to an office over on Powers Ferry. But for many, many years, I was always officed in Cobb County. And the interesting thing about what I remember was that Cobb sort of went through a transformation in the late 70s, early 80s. There were presidents of the chamber like Chet Austin, Earl Patton, folks like that. And back then, the office was in an industrial park up towards the Canton Highway. And many of us thought that was an inappropriate location for what we thought was going to be the strongest suburban chamber of commerce around. And I remember to this day, Earl Patton walked in and said that he felt like he could get the Rockefellers to donate a piece of property for a location in North by Northwest. And I was so sure that he wouldn't do it. I said, well, if you can get the property volunteered, I'll figure out how to build it and raise the money. And so about 3 or 4 months later, he comes in with the deed and says, John, get to work. And that's what we did. We actually had a big group of folks that we called together, and I wrote the first check. And by the time we finished with everybody throwing it into the pot, we'd actually raised enough money to build it without any debt, which we thought was a big deal. And I was involved with a company with Johnny Gresham, and we furnished a developer who ended up building that first building, and we built it very economically but well designed. And so we built it on a piece of property we didn't have to pay for, and we built it with money that we didn't have to go borrow. So I always thought that was a pretty significant thing. And I give credit to folks like Earl Patton and Chet Austin and that group of leaders who sort of led Cobb County into what I call the next generation, which was an orientation more closely tied to 285 in the Cumberland area.
So,
Can I close these doors?
sure.
Sure.
Okay. So the next question, which is pretty broad, you may just talk for a while. When you think back over the last 30 years or so, 25 to 30 years,
40.
40 even, and I've already had this happen. People go to SunTrust Park and they look around and they say, how did all this happen? And there's just a handful of people who can tell that story, and you're one of them. And the people who could are one by one passing away, like Betty Siegel now, as you know.
And she was one of those early leaders like Chet and others who had a bigger dream for the Cobb Chamber of Commerce and a bigger dream for Cobb County. And it started with different political leadership and basically the early days when I was involved, Cobb County would be strictly a Democratic stronghold, and it made a shift over the years to basically a Republican stronghold. Might be shifting back, as a matter of fact. But there were some great leaders of the community back in those days, and that had a lot of influence on me and probably helped me to understand that you need to dream a little bit big if you want to get something accomplished.
Well, talk a little bit about those people that were part of making Cobb County who it is today.
Well, in my era, one would be Mac Hennison. Mac actually was serving in the term before me, and unfortunately within a couple of months he had a heart attack. And so I stepped up for the remainder of his term, plus my term. So I had an opportunity to lead the chamber for an unusually long period of time, almost 2 years. And during that period, Earl Smith had been elected to the Cobb Commission as chairman, and he wanted to have a very aggressive program to take Cobb County to the next level, and I made sure that the chamber was in lockstep with him. And something that happens today in Atlanta is the Links trip. Well, the first Links trip actually was in Cobb County, and it was a group of business people and political leaders, and we went up to the D.C. area to study how suburban counties worked in relationship to D.C. We studied transportation and how you could have a separate transportation system in Virginia that could tie into the D.C. Transportation hub. And we found out there was companies up there or counties up there doing something similar to a CID, but not exactly correct. And they all had bus systems. And so we came back from that trip with a thought process that we were going to see if that could stimulate us to do some things. And it did. We ended up with the CID that came directly out of that trip. We figured out that we could do something and maybe do it a little bit better than what they were doing up in Washington. Didn't realize it was going to take so much effort. It took me working with two great community leaders and legislators, Roy Barnes and Johnny Isaacson, to first get the preliminary legislation of a CID, that was sort of a unique thing to do because the county and the state was giving basically a group of private citizens the ability to levy a tax, unheard of, but we were convincing them that we weren't going to run off with the money, we were going to invest it, and so we were able to get the legislation put in place. It got voted on. Then we had to do essentially a constitutional amendment that we got passed. And then Earl Smith and I then spent the next 6 months, along with Tad, by the way, Lee Thad, to get everybody signed up to effectively tax themselves. It was a pretty remarkable effort. But we put in So the first CID by many, many years was the Cumberland CID, and there's no telling how much work has been done by that CID to stimulate great road systems, bicycle paths, walking trails. That's the one thing we didn't deal with.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'll kill it. So we were able to take that CID and leverage it into something that had a dramatic effect on this whole area. And it also served, because it was so well run and accomplished so much, it became the model for other CIDs throughout the entire state. And now I think there are probably 2 or 3 dozen either in place or trying to get in place.
Yeah, I think there are 18 of them now.
Yeah.
17 or 18, and ours continues to be the model. Describe how you got the board put together. I think you were the first chair. Is that right?
I was the first chair, and it was a political process, because you had to get people who represented some of the parks that were paying the most money. So I remember Trey from BF Saul, which, by the way, turned out to be the ultimate property that was where the Braves ended up building. There was somebody from Cousins, and somebody from the Cobb Galleria area. There was somebody from Cumberland Mall. Anyway, the board was representative primarily of people with large land holdings in the area. And then I was the chairman, and I was elected by all the other folks to serve as chairman, which I think I did for a number of years. And then Tad Lethat, who was, I call him my cleanup hitter, he came in behind me and has run the chamber far better than I could ever run it, and has done a great job with it.
Yeah, I go to every CID board meeting, and they celebrated the 25th anniversary, as you know, was a couple of years ago. And you did a marvelous job of, and I wish we'd have videotaped it, of telling the story about things like the Cobb Galleria Center, how it got built, and the struggles that you had to go through to make that happen. And Cobb wouldn't be who it is today if it wasn't for those kind of efforts. So if you talk a little bit about the build-up and how all that took place.
Well, sure. So let's go a little bit further out in time. So we had built a new chamber building in sort of the South Cobb area, and that in itself created some level of conflict, because for years Cobb County politically was run by folks from Marietta, and now there was a sharing of responsibility and political leadership, and they didn't go down so easy. They liked to run the ship, and now they were sharing running the ship. But there were, through a program of work at the chamber, we felt like that if we could build a convention center, that it would be very popular, because there was really no really good venues for medium-sized shows, and not everybody wanted to go downtown to the World Congress Center. And there was a vehicle that had been put in place to finance high school stadiums and soccer fields. And I can't even think of the original name of it. I guess I ought to go back and research it. But we felt like that could be a vehicle that we could reshape and would be an authority that we could put in place to ultimately try to raise the money to build the convention center, the Cobb Marietta Convention Center. So we put it in place. We had a great initial board. We tried to mix people from literally all over. And since I was the one sort of putting together, one of the things I always thought was very important is that it not be a political program. We didn't want it to be a work program for all the political hacks in Cobb County. So we set it up so that you had mayors of Marietta and Smyrna who were on the board, the Cobb County Commission chairman. So that's 3 people, but 4 folks were private citizens and really were involved in the business community. So from the very beginning, it was run like a business and not like a political function. And I served as the initial chairman and tried to set up programs and procedures so that when we did build it, it could be maintained. We would have enough money put into a sinking fund that we could pay our bills, etc. So again, we went through the process of taking and putting that in place. We went to the county and to the state and got a part of the hotel motel tax. That gave us cash flow that we could take and bond. We did a bond indenture which allowed us to build the facility. Well, here comes the next series of issues, and that was, where were you going to locate it? Well, I was always driven from the standpoint that you located it somewhere where it could be successful. And that's all I ever thought about. I didn't, if we'd have put it out somewhere where it wouldn't have been successful, it would have been wrapped around my neck. So there were a lot of folks that wanted it up in Marietta. And because of location, etc., I didn't think that was really the place that it needed to be. And so it just so happened there was sort of a defunct piece of property right at 285 and 41, an old mall that just had never been successful, and I felt like we could tack onto that and build something, and within a few years, anybody that looked at it could never figure out that it was never part of the original mall. So we hired a fellow named Bill Reynolds, Smallwood Reynolds, great architect, somebody I actually knew in grammar school and high school and through Georgia Tech. And he was able to come up with a magical solution. Tad was involved, Tad Leithhead was involved in that time, and he was actually working for the folks that owned that mall. And so we were able to put it together. We actually were able to build on it without having to pay anything for the land. And but there were a number of people didn't think it should be at that location. They thought it should be further up north I-75. Well, frankly, I'm pretty sure it wouldn't have been successful had we done that. And then we were going to call it the Cumberland, I think, Exhibit Hall Authority, and we got shot down politically. It was always after that called the Cobb Exhibit Hall Authority, and that was fair because the money was actually coming from Cobb County. But it was very interesting all through those years. Most people thought that Cobb County was paying for this facility, and I used to tell people the only way you're paying for it, if you're sleeping in a hotel in Cobb County. If you're sleeping in a hotel in Cobb County and you're also a Cobb County resident, it probably means you shouldn't be sleeping in that damn hotel. But because we had a great funding mechanism, we set up a sinking fund, and I insisted that it was going to have to be built first class, that would pass the test of time. And we went through lots of projections about what size and how big the ballroom would be. And what we wanted is something to be totally successful. Well, again, there was no way of getting folks unanimously involved in something like that. And we had another catalyst, and that was the Olympics. And again, people forget this. If you go into the exhibit hall, you'll see that it has super high ceilings. Well, the reason why is Cobb County, we had worked hard to have the exhibit hall as part of the facilities for the 1996 Olympics. We had softball being played outside of Marietta, and then we had volleyball and some other things that were going to be played in the exhibit hall. And I remember one day somebody called me and said, "Have you heard what the Cobb County Commission have done?" And I said, "Well, nothing would surprise me. Tell me what they've done." they've passed this gay resolution against gay lifestyles. And I said, whoa, stop. And they repeated it again. And I knew damn well probably the next phone call I would get would be from Billy Payne, which it was. And he says, John, this is too hard for us to tolerate. We're taking all of our commitments away from Cobb County to participate in the 1996 Olympics. And so couldn't believe it, it's like you were taking your foot and trying to see how far down your mouth you could stick it, and that's what we did. But nevertheless, we built the facility. If you go into it, you need to look at the super high ceiling because it was done for a purpose. And but we persevered and we built it. Now the good news is, based on what I've heard and what I think I know, it's the most successful suburban exhibit hall and convention center in the United States. And it's been profitable from the first month it was put in service. So it's been a great gift to Cobb County, and no telling how many jobs it's stimulated over the years. And I think it proved out to be in the right location at the confluence of 75, 285, and 41.
So let's continue this same theme. Then along came the idea of the Cobb Energy Center.
Yeah, well, that's another issue that we actually had in the original funding for the exhibit hall. We had about $20 to $25 million that we were going to use to do something related to performing arts, and a lot of conversation at that time was talked about taking the old theaters in the Cobb Galleria Center and remodeling them into a large hall and a smaller hall. I actually remember seeing and looking at the plans, and it probably would have worked. And I got a call one day, and it said, you better show up at a Cobb County Commission meeting because you're about to get skinned. And I said, what? So I remember going down there, and it'd be very interesting for you to get Max Bacon to tell you this story, but because Max was standing right behind me, and Joe Mac Wilson snuck up behind me and said, boy, you fixing to find out that who has the money has the power. And I think I cussed him out or whatever, but he walked in there, and when it was all said and done, that money that I thought was going to go to a exhibit hall ended up going to the Marietta Convention Center. Most people don't realize that the funding that we had set up, basically part of it was taken away and used for the Marietta Conference Center, which I don't think has ever been terribly successful. I'm glad it's there, but I mean it has not been successful. So the original exhibit hall did not have anything to do with the Performing Arts Center all that time, but all of us felt like it needed to happen. And so the hotel motel tax was growing, and because we had been very careful with the money we spent for the exhibit hall, we were able to draw off some money and then raise some money so that we were able to 10 years later build the Performing Arts Center, and a lot of it happened through a generous gift from I think technically it came from Gas South, but it was a big anchoring gift to build that facility. So that facility is run by the Cobb Marietta Exhibit Hall Authority, and again, it's very successful and produces cash flow on its own and is able to service the debt. And again, it was built first class. I remember when we were developing the plans, it was, again, everybody was so pleased with the job Smallwood Reynolds did. We called him back in to do it again, and we traveled literally all over the place looking at mid-size performing arts centers. and we had a lot of studies that were done to build the right size, and around 2,900 seats was about the right size. We didn't compete fully with Fox, but it was the right size for Metro Atlanta, and that's been that facility has been a great hit. The thing that's very interesting to me is, with all the animosity in the years related to Cobb County as it relates to the city of Atlanta and Metro Atlanta, we end up with both the Atlanta Ballet and the Atlanta Opera Company, which I think is sort of ironic, but it's a fabulous facility for those guys. And I suspect at some point in time, a lot of the symphony concerts will be if somebody would work hard at it, I think you could get a lot of the symphony concerts at that location.
Not only that, but now the Atlanta Braves and Atlanta United, so there's a lot of things with Atlanta on them that are now in that same area that you
fabulous.
Create.
Yeah, and I really do believe when I first heard about the Braves, I poo-pooed it. I really didn't think it was. I thought they were using Cobb County to trade the city of Atlanta. But as I heard more and more about it, the rationale for putting it at that location, there was a lot of things that made me think maybe this was really going to happen. But the road work and the access to where they are all came out of the road improvements from the CID, and then a lot of the further improvements that have been done for access were also funded by the CID. So when people were first talking about it, I remember reading the articles that it would take people hours to go to a game and hours to get back home. When I go to a game, it takes me 20 minutes to get to my parking place, and it takes me 20 minutes to get home. So all that was not accurate. It's a wonderful location with a lot of access points, and I don't think traffic or commute times to the stadium have really never come up again.
No, they haven't. In setting up for this interview, I had a conversation with Tad about your standards, and I asked him if you would be willing to be kind of our producer, because as Tad said it, and it's true, everything you've always done has been at very high standards. Whether it was Post Properties, or whether it was the Galleria, or whether it's Performing Arts Center, or whether it was
well, I would, yeah.
Talk about yourself a little bit. What drives you?
Well, I for the exhibit hall, I looked at every single page, and I remember there was somebody had gone through and valued, injured, and taken a lot of the tile out of the bathrooms, and one thing that I insisted on, that we had self-flushing toilets, because I've been into facilities like that and people don't flush the damn toilet and it's nasty. So there were about 40 things that I wrote down that I said I was going to make sure that we did. Great carpet, great bathrooms, great fixtures, and we sent out to Europe for the chandeliers and the ballroom. So there was never really any cost cutting relative to the quality of either the Cobb Galleria or the Performing Arts Center, because I was hands-on those plans from the very beginning.
Well, even with Post Properties, your reputation was building a quality product. What drives you? What made you be an individual that set high standards for everything you did? Whether it's a yacht, you always set very high standards. What drives you, John? Well,
I think there's only one way to do things, and that's do it in a first-class manner. And there's too much you see out there that only got 95% done, and I can't stand that as a real estate developer. It's really the last 5% that determines whether something's going to be great or not so great. And so I always worked on the last 5%, not the first 95%. And I always got a payback when I did that.
When you think back of the history of Cobb County, and we asked Roy the same thing. There's probably a couple of periods of time where you had a fork in the road. You could go left or you could go right, and you made the right turn. Can you think back of some decisions that you and others faced together where you made the decision, even if it was risky, to go one direction versus another?
Well, I remember moving the Cobb Chamber from up in sort of the heart of Marietta down to sort of the new part of Cobb County. That turned out to be a great decision, and one that I don't think there could be anybody who would have any regrets, although I'll be honest with you. One of the things I remember is we had to work very hard on the address. When you send something, even though everybody around it is in a Atlanta zip code, the Cobb Chamber is not. You send it, it goes to Marietta. And I always thought that was sort of fun, but I guess it worked for those folks in Marietta. But I don't have anything against. In fact, I think Marietta is a fabulous spot. Most people don't even remember this, but in 1982 or 83, I visited Ernest Barrett, who was a fabulous leader for Cobb County and did a lot for water and sewer, and really set us up for the kind of growth we're getting today in Cobb County. And there was a model sitting in his office, and it showed a courthouse, but a administration building where the square is now. And I said, Mr. Chairman, are you seriously thinking about doing that? Yeah, we need to grow, and that's about the only place we can grow. I said, well, you can't do that. And he said, well, we'll see. And I left, and I said, even though I loved Ernest and thought he was great, I was determined he was not going to tear down and use that square for a building. As it turns out, I don't think he could any because of the way it was gifted to Cobb County. So I started immediately trying to figure out a way to take and redo that park. At that point in time, it was nasty. You had pigeons and birds all over the place, bird crap everywhere you looked, and people didn't use it because it was so bad. And I got a land planner and landscape architect that we'd used, and we did a plan. And I figured that to do it right, it was going to cost about $500,000. And again, I wasn't going to be able to ask other people for money unless I put money in it. So I wrote a check for $250,000 to sort of get it started. And I remember one of the guys that I went to visit, and actually Roy said, "Well, you don't get any money out there." I went to Harold Willingham. And Harold Willingham wrote a check for, I think, $50,000 to put the fountain in the middle of the square. Somebody actually ought to go back and relook at where the money came from and who did what, because that ought to be, there ought to be some record of that. But we took and raised over $500,000 to redo it, and I went out there and helped supervise the brick sidewalks and all that, and where we put in the original flowers. And then our company, again, I don't think anybody realizes this, but for 10 years we maintained that park. We planted the flowers, we cut the grass, we cleaned it, and after 10 years I said, boys, you need to be able to go do this on your own. And we had taught them enough that they do a fabulous job. Well, another thing that happened a few years after that was at the city of Smyrna. I was there for some matter, and the city council was talking about building a community center. And I remember like it was yesterday, they were going to put it at Tolleson Park. And I went up to Max, I said, Max, you can't do that. He was looking at me like, why? I said, put it in, if you want to make Smyrna something great, put it in the middle of Smyrna and start working on putting your fire station there and everything you can think, so you create a city center. And again, I wrote a big check and did landscaping and maintenance for a long time until they got the ability to do it on their own. So I feel especially proud of the fact that both the square in Marietta and City of Smyrna redo, I was directly involved in, and I think those are public spaces that people are able to enjoy, and whether I get credit for it or not, I don't give a damn. But the fact that it got done helps enhance the quality of life and what you see in Cobb County. And I mean, that's important. I'm a real estate developer, and most people think of a real estate developer as somebody always taking down trees, etc. And I've always felt like we had a higher standard to put stuff back in to a community because of that. So that's always been my philosophy. Bet you didn't know that one.
No, I didn't know that. Now, I knew you had some involvement with Marietta, but I don't have Max on my interview list.
But you need to.
I'm going to put Max on there.
Yeah, you need to.
Enjoy Max. The hard part.
Yeah, you're gonna have a lot of a lot of editing.
Yeah. So when history is written about Cobb County 25, 30 years from now, and you and I neither one will be around.
Say for yourself. Speak for yourself.
My dad lived to be 95. Maybe I get there. But how do you want history to remember you?
Oh gosh, I really hadn't thought about it. I started a great company at a very young age. Took it public, and it's now gone and disappeared. And at almost 70, I started another big public company that was almost zero. We started at zero, and today it's closing in on a $3 billion company. And most people don't get a chance to do that once, but I've been able to do it a fair amount. The other thing I've enjoyed is being involved in banking in Cobb County. I was on the board of the First National Bank of Cobb when I was probably 27 or 28, 29, and through a long series of maneuvers, a fellow named Bud Shaw ended up in control of the bank. He had some health issues and offered me a chance to buy it, and so at a very young age I was able to buy First National Bank of Cobb and run it for a number of years. And I had then decided, well, am I going to be a real estate developer or am I going to be a banker? And so we sold the bank to Barnett, and that turned out well. Kessel Stelling and I started Riverside Bank. And early on, when I was 26 years old, there used to be a bank called Cobb Bank and Trust that was ultimately sold, I think, to CNS. And I went on that board when I was 25 years old, or 25 and a half. So I've been very lucky to be involved in banking in Cobb County. And when I was involved in banking, it was a great business because you were lending money to people who were doing things and creating things. It's tougher for banks nowadays to actually do that.
Well, I think people will always remember you, based on the question I asked earlier, doing things first rate.
Or doing them first.
Doing first? Well, that's a good point. Doing it first.
The problem I have, even before and thereafter, is I think you have to sort of dream big. You're limited in what you accomplish by your own level of vision, and Cobb County right now should look at all the things that have been done, but there needs to be another big thing, and somebody needs to decide what that is, and let's all probably too late for me, but let's go out and get it done.
I think there are many people, and you probably can comment on the Cobb County at one point was the place to be, and it's not where it wants to be now. And one of the reasons was lack of vision and lack of leadership.
Correct.
And that's just something we don't want to ever see happen here.
Correct. Gwinnett County I actually think Gwinnett County has been good for Cobb County because you had two suburban counties, both trying to excel, and we competed with Gwinnett County. And by having Gwinnett County there, it probably made us better in Cobb County.
Yeah.
I didn't want to see them do anything that we didn't end up doing better.
And that's been the case, actually. How would you describe the decision-making process in Cobb County? And I know every decision has a little bit different course of action, but when you, as one of the godfathers of this community, when y'all wanted some decision to be made, can you talk about what the style was to get a decision on big issues?
Well, Cobb County's been blessed with incredible good political leadership matched with good business leadership. I was blessed in sort of my era with having Roy Barnes and Johnny Isaacson as go-to guys. But, we had a lot of great political leaderships other than those two guys. We had the beginning of the Republican Party in Cobb County, so there was always good political leadership in Cobb County. Going back to actually Ernest Barrett and his relentless work with sewer and water, which are critical to quality growth in a community. I remember, again, I was very young, and there used to be a group would meet for breakfast, and it was Ernest Barrett and a couple of the judges, Joe Mack, Wilson, probably Mac Henderson, and one morning I got an invite to a breakfast. I didn't know who it was or what was going on, and I walked in and I saw, at that time we only had two judges, both of them were there, and Ernest Barrett was there. There was a fellow named George Langford who was also very active back then, and I said, whoa, what am I doing here? But basically that group talked about how to make the county grow and do well and what could we do on roads. Back then, at that meeting, it was a discussion on I-75, where it needed to go and how it needed to, there was a big discussion on where we actually had crossroads and access. And I think most of those decisions were made in that room. And it turned out to be really good for Kennesaw and Ackworth and that area to the north.
A topic I'm sure you love to talk about. Talk a little bit about the media, the Marietta Daily Journal and the business community.
Yeah, well, Otis and I had a love-hate relationship. Otis was the OM of all OMs and felt like things should revolve around Marietta. And here comes this young guy named John Williams who thought otherwise. So, I used to tell people I carried a lot of arrows in my back from Otis, but it wasn't, it wasn't mean-spirited. He just had his beliefs and I had mine. And I remember not long before he passed away, he and I visited, and he told me, he said, well, you can't go tell anybody else this, but now I guess I am. You made the right decision on where the exhibit hall was built. And I said, well, you made the right decision forcing us to call it the Cobb Marietta Exhibit Hall. So we sort of squared away with each other after that.
How long was that before he passed away?
Probably maybe 3 months.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was very comforting and made me sort of feel good because we had clashed a lot over the years.
Yeah. I put together something for Otis about a year before he passed away. I got Johnny, Conley Ingram.
Conley was another one, by the way, that was involved in that early Cobb leadership, consisting of Chet Austin and Conley and Earl Patton and a lot of folks that preceded me.
Yeah, I wanted to get sort of on the record. There's a lot of names of people that I have picked up over the years that were key players. I'm just going to run through them, and any of them that you want to comment on.
If you have a good story, a good PG-13.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's start with Mac Henderson.
Mac was just one of the most gracious, most fantastic men I've ever been around. And again, most people don't realize this, but we when we needed a county manager, Johnny Greshman and I both came up with the idea to promote Mac Henderson, and he was only going to go into it for maybe a month or two, and I think he stayed for over 2 years and did a great job. Mac is just he is Cobb County through and through, and really was a great leader in his era.
Kessel Stelling.
Kessel is fabulous, best banker in the state of Georgia, and somebody who would have thought that he would be running one of the biggest banks in the state, second biggest, I guess. He's I think Kessel, myself, and I can't remember who else. Well, the only two-termer chamber chairman. Who else was
Rob
it?
Garcia.
Rob Garcia. Now I tell them all that I'm a little bit more because I took the rest of Mac Henderson's term when he had a heart attack. So they served 2 years. I served 2.5.
Johnny Isaacson. Back in those days before he was a United States Senator, just Johnny.
Johnny is just so remarkable. He's one of the best public speakers that I know of. He can get up extemporaneously, talk about any subject, and do it in such a convincing way. I just admire him almost beyond belief. I will tell you a story about Johnny. I lived over on Paper Mill at the time, and he comes up to me and says, "Look, we're trying to get the Republican Party started in Cobb County. Would you hold a barbecue in your backyard?" I lived at the intersection of Woodlawn and Paper Mill. And I said, "Well, how many folks we think we're talking about?" He said 100, maybe 150. I said, "We can handle that." And he said, "Well, I'll go out, I'll cook a couple of shoulders, and I'll do." So, I mean, we were planning on 100 folks. And then a few days beforehand, he calls me up and says, "We're going to probably have more people." And I said, "Why?" He said, "Barry Goldwater has agreed to come and be there and be the keynote speaker." And I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. How many? What's now going to happen to us?" He said, "There's going to be a lot more people." And then the day before, there was an incident where North Korea, I think, took over a ship called the Mariqueza or something like that. So every news network in the country was parked out in my front yard because they wanted to interview Barry Goldwater, who was sort of the hawk on all that. And so it went from a party of about 100 folks to, we think there were maybe 1,500. And we had to call the sheriff's department because there was such traffic jams that we thought people were going to get killed. But I remember that Barry Goldwater comes in and somebody said, "Do you have a place for him to sit for a few minutes and relax?" I said, "He can go back to my bedroom." And before that, we were told he needed to have a fifth of bourbon, and the only thing he drank at that time is name me an expensive bourbon. I don't.
Chivas Regal.
Maybe it was, and he needed to have a quart of that. He needed to have some M&Ms, half peanuts, half non-peanuts, and so we set all that stuff out. And so he went back there, and there was a rocking chair, and he sat in the rocking chair, and it was about 40 minutes before we got him ready to come out. And by that time, he had to sit in the house where he was being interviewed by all these national TV folks. So we went back to get him, and so he's being walked up there. I looked in, and the damn bottle only had about an inch left in it, and there was not a single M&M left on the table. And I said, "Holy mackerel, what is he going to say?" He was as lucid. I wish I could have been as lucid as he was. But in the meantime, we were on a septic tank. We had that thing blowing up about 6 feet high So Johnny, I said, Johnny, let's give it a break for a couple of years before I host another one of your parties, and so he'll always owe me.
I'm going to be trying to interview him, so I'll cycle back to that.
Yeah, ask him about that.
So, a couple other names you're real familiar with. Chet Austin.
Chet, again, incredibly courtly, well respected. Ernest Barrett and all the political leadership looked towards Chet for everything, and he was a consummate sort of businessman. Ran a big business in Cobb County. He was a great golfer, and I was never a golfer, but he would be able to take people out to play golf. Ernest Barrett played golf, and when we wanted something, we sent somebody to go play with him that would let him win. Generally, it would work.
Fred Bentley, senior.
Fred, again, a great Toastmaster, somebody who was always very smart and very logical in his thought process. He was an OM, and so you had to sort of make sure that you always understood he was an OM. But he was a great guy, and very active in the chamber, very active in the community, and someone that I looked up to early on.
Bernie Brown is the name that's synonymous with our history. He was involved in Wellstar from the very beginning, I guess, or at least the early stages. Did you have any involvement with that?
Don't know him.
Okay. Kerman Keenan.
I met him, but I didn't know him. He was extremely well respected.
Bob Prilliman.
Bob is great. Bob is somebody that's a can-do guy. If you sit around a table and you talk about maybe going to get this done, Bob would be the first one to say, yes, let's go do it. And he'd be one of the first ones to either write a check or go out and try to make it happen. He's a real can-do person and has provided great leadership in Cobb County over the years.
Was he part of a smaller group of people like yourself?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Earl Smith.
Nobody better than Earl. Earl probably has had more impact on the county than anybody I know of. When we did that field trip, I went to him and said, let's take a bunch of business people and politicians up to D.C. Well, he was the leader, and he did just such a fabulous job. But we came back from that trip, and we ended up doing the CID, local option sales tax, Cobb Community Transit, and ultimately CID all came from that trip to Washington, D.C. during his term.
David Hankerson.
David was fabulous, and based on a county manager form of government, he was the consummate manager, and that's a tough job because you're dealing with 5 personalities on the commission. It's a thankless job, but he was able to handle it all and made a significant impact on Cobb County.
Johnny Gresh.
Johnny was, again, great, and Johnny has been a friend for 40 years. We were business partners. He's on the board of my company, and he's another can-do guy that basically I don't think he knows the word no. He's a can-do guy.
What will his place in history be?
I don't like to think of him as history. I like to think of him as a contemporary, but he was involved. He was the one that built, in reality, he built the Cobb Chamber building. I mean, he was involved in a lot of stuff that people don't realize, but he's always been somebody that could get things done. He was a DOT, member of the DOT and chairman at one time, so he's always been somebody who can get stuff done.
I ran into him about a week ago. Something that looked good. And Earl Smith, I was in a function with Earl about 2 weeks ago, and he's not looking so good either. I think Rachel's loss was, I don't know what his will to live is anymore.
Well-
there's a group called Red Rock. You've probably been out to that
Yeah.
before.
Well, Earl, Rachel, not only was his companion, his business partner, and so that's a little bit different. In fact, there's a picture up there with Earl and Rachel and me, and this was after we knew Rachel was quite ill, and we were doing a function at Cobb Exhibit Hall, and I was surprised she was there, and I talked him into letting me take a picture with all three of us, and I keep it up there where I could see it.
Yeah, I saw it when it came in. Jim Roden.
Oh, Jim's another can-do type of guy, and quietly back behind a lot of other folks. He's involved in a lot of things. He was instrumental. I think Leadership Cobb developed really under both me and him, and
Chet Austin likes to talk about that. He was involved in.
He was.
Yeah.
He was. And so I think that's been a great program for Cobb County, and has produced a lot of folks who really know something about how things get done and how they happen.
Newt Gingrich. Did you have much involvement with Newt?
Yeah, I did. I thought Newt was incredibly sharp. I was in 1970 something, 76. I was president of the Atlanta Home Builders Association, and John Whelan, myself, a bunch of us, prior to that, had raised money for his first campaign, and he got beat. And then we all raised money for his second campaign, and I don't think after that he ever lost.
One thing Ty and I are going to do is sort of blend pictures in with stories, and you're loaded with so many pictures.
This is 520, and I have another 500 that are boxed up.
Well, we want to take a picture and let you just talk about whatever.
Well, there's one over there that relates to the Performing Arts Center.
I have this in my office as well. Which one is that? This is
That one.
Yeah. That was 2007. You'll hit that one too.
And up to the left, most people didn't know it. Ken Nix was a great friend, and he and I, when I was going to Georgia Tech, he was going to Emory, and we both worked for the YMCA and coached kids. So he was a friend of mine going back to, I guess I was 17 years old. So.
I hated Ken and
Yes.
I became pretty close. I hated the way his career ended up.
Yeah, you aren't kidding.
That's so sad. Let's see, I saw a picture of it. Where's the one? Who's that young guy?
That's me. I did look a lot younger there.
Yeah. I did see one with you. You Get Started Again. What was the one that said
Who
John
knows?
Williams again?
Maybe right there. No, that one.
That's
I
supposed to be Ward.
Yeah, I don't know.
I've got a, here we go. This is the Marietta Daily Journal. Now, this is with Earl Smith. We were talking about Earl, and I'll have some additional. I've got a box of old chamber pictures, John.
I'd love to see them.
Yeah, I'll get them for you. They're really phenomenal. In fact, when the building was built, there was Earl Patton was in it, and a lot of people. I'm pretty sure you were in at least one of those pictures. Okay.
Well, like I say, the chamber, the way the thing got built is, I remember telling him, if you get that property, I'll figure out a way to raise the money and build it. And he held my feet to the fire.
All right, here's one. So business to business, he's back. This is after you opened up the new company. Is that what that was about?
Probably, yep.
Business to business.
Yep.
want to ask just a couple more questions. I know you're getting tired. It's hard to keep talking, but in terms of Metro Atlanta going beyond Cobb County,
Yeah.
what involvement have you had with the Falcons?
Back a number of years ago, I was on the Lovett board, and when I got on the board very young, and this is basically when people still smoked. And since I was the last guy in there, my seat was all the way at the end, and it was next to Rankin Smith, and he smoked like a chimney, but he and I sort of hit it off, and he wanted to know about what was going on with real estate, and so every 3 or 4 or 5 months we'd meet for lunch, and usually at the Capital City Club, same table, same lunch, and one day he asked me, he said, "Have you ever thought about owning the Falcons?" And I sort of laughed. I said, "Well, that's way over my pay grade." And he says, "Well, I think I have it set up so that my kids can end up owning the Falcons, but it's very important for me for the Falcons to stay in Atlanta, and if they can't, if the trust that he'd set up and how he'd set it up didn't work, did I know somebody who would be able to buy the Falcons?" And I said, "Well, I have a good friend that might be interested. His name is Arthur Blank." He says, "Well, I hadn't met Arthur. I'd like to meet him." So I think I was on a trip with Arthur, and I sort of casually mentioned to him, "Have you ever thought about owning a sports team?" He said, "Yeah, well, how'd you know?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know, but he was, based on what I remember, was messing around with a basketball team." And I said, "Well, what would you think about the Falcons?" And he looks at me like I'm crazy. I said, "Well, I think it might be something that could happen. You need to just sort of follow my lead." So I set up a meeting, and the three of us went down to the Capital City Club. And the first words out of Rankin Smith's mouth was, "The team isn't for sale." And Arthur said, "Well, I'm not here to buy it." So after that was cleared there, we had a nice lunch, and then I said, "Rankin, I think Arthur would buy the team." And he says, "Well, that's good to know, but I don't think that's going to take place." So maybe a couple of years, maybe a year and a half, he falls ill and passes away. Taylor Glover takes over the team, and I don't know for sure, but I think when they probated the will and went through the program with the IRS, there wasn't enough money for them to be able to hold on to it and pay their taxes. So I get a call from Taylor Smith one day, and he said, "My daddy told me to call you if the Falcons were ever going to be for sale." And I'm not saying they're going to be for sale, but he said to call you. I said, "Taylor, you can trust my confidence. I told your dad that I thought the guy that could and would buy the Falcons would be Arthur Blank." And he said, "Well, I want you to set up a meeting." So I set up a meeting with Arthur and Taylor, and they got along just fine. And I think Taylor was, I don't think Taylor wanted to sell the team, but I think he knew he probably had to. And so as I remember it, Arthur was meeting him, I think at his house one Saturday morning, and he called me and says, "Come over for a cup of coffee." And it was terrible because he doesn't drink coffee. It was Sanka or something like that. So he says, "Well, I might end up buying a football team today." And so I said, "Well, Arthur, how much are you going to have to pay for it?" He said, $480 million. He said, "I've got Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and everybody to do a value, and I think the value is going to be no more than 480. I said, "Well, stick to your guns." I went on to work, and I get a call to swing back by his house. And I swung back by his house, and he comes out and says, "Partner, we own a team." And I'm thinking, "Partner? What do you mean, partner?" And I said, "Well, Arthur, how much you pay?" And I think he said $540 million. So that was substantially more than what he agreed to pay. And I said, "Oh, you said you were going to pay more than 480." He said, "Well, 480 is what the team's worth. The rest of it is ego." And then he then proceeded to say, "Now, I want you to own part of it." I said, "Well, Arthur, you're not going to give me a piece of it. I'm not going to have you going around forever telling everybody you gave me a piece of the Falcon for helping you with the deal." So I bought a small piece, and I've owned a piece ever since.
Well,
But I think he would tell you that if it hadn't been for me, he probably wouldn't have owned the Falcons.
how does it feel to have that much impact on history?
Oh, I don't even think about it. I don't, but it's turned out great, and I knew he'd be a great owner. His office is right behind.
Oh, right, I know. I've been over to
And
this
Bernie,
foundation.
yeah, and Bernie is right there. Arthur's there, and I'm
Okay.
here. So it'll be interesting.
It's kind of interesting how that worked out.
Yeah.
You hosted one time a Leadership Cobb event over here in your office. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
When you get back from surgery and feel like it, we'd love to bring the Chairman's Club group here.
Sure.
Let you host them, and you might be able to do it before you leave. But
Well, you know where it would be? It would be outside.
yes, right.
Have you seen that deck out there?
I haven't, but I've heard.
I'll show you as we walk
Yeah.
out.
But that was a request that came from a lot of our Chairman's Club members. A couple of them that went on came out here on that Leadership Cobb trip. I know.
Yeah, I could. Let's see, September 11th. I could probably do it in early November.
Okay. Okay.
That'd be weather should be nice then.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will.
If not,
cycle back with you.
if not, I'll let somebody prop me up.
We're gonna have a lot to prop yourself up on.
Yeah.
So while we capture anything about the Cobb County or your history that you might want to just go ahead and get on the record right now?
Gosh.
We're not going. By the way, we're not going to release anything you had to sign.
No. I think you pretty well captured it all. At one time, I was through Post Properties, was the largest taxpayer in Cobb County next to Lockheed. And Cobb County was a great place to develop and build because a lot of young people were coming in. And then really, I still thought that, quote, gay resolution, I think it held back restaurants and a lot of things that should have been in Cobb County much earlier than it was. And that was just pure stupidity by some of those board members.
Well, I think it's like Birmingham has an image from the 60s.
I think Cobb County still has a little bit of a tinge, and it's a shame.
Well, I tell people that our Executive Vice President of Economic Development, Brooks Mathis, is gay. I said we've come a long way when the point person for economic development
sure.
is gay. So
Yeah, that's a good thing because that was just such an awful thing, and I can't tell you the stuff that unwound after that, and it was just no cause for it, to be quite honest with you.
Well, when you go down and think about the bad decisions made in Cobb, that has to be way up near the top.
Maybe the top.
Yeah.
Otherwise, when I think about what's happened in Cobb County, Cobb County has been blessed with getting most things right, and I'm not sure that you would change much of anything that's happened in all candor.
So you mentioned this earlier, and I would like to get your thoughts about this. And every so often, you have to have visionary leadership to go to the next level. And it's kind of like today we've achieved a lot that people like you envisioned a long time ago. We've reached that pinnacle where this is the place to be. We're entertaining 2 Fortune 100 companies, one tonight and one tomorrow. They're thinking of consolidating. One's in Chicago, about 500 jobs. People want to come here now.
Yeah. Well, we're still talking. We own the property adjacent to the apartment property we did called Encore. And as you remember,
Yeah, I remember.
Encore was supposed to be a mixed-use development with some retail, some office, and some residential. And as a matter of course, Cobb County would give incentives for folks who were willing to develop a company and develop a workforce in Cobb County. And to my knowledge, we were the first one. Don't ask me why. As much as I'd done inside the county that people took off after my hide, but I think I was the first and maybe the only one they ever turned down. Hence, I'm in the city of Atlanta. I would like to go back and as my final office, final resting place. We have the property next to Encore zone for a 400,000 square foot office building, and again, a mixed-use development with some apartments. Well, we're getting ready to start thinking about doing that, and we would bring about 100,000 square feet, maybe 120,000 square feet with us to that building. But I'm a little nervous about how I'm going to be treated this next time around.
It will be very different. I've spent more time talking with Tad during that time than I did my own wife. We got one of the school board members deselected because of his outspoken nature, and it's one of those kill one, scare the rest. It'll be a whole different thing. You helped us. You may not really understand this, but you helped us rewrite how we do those development authority deals now.
Well, good. Well, I mean, we're very pleased with the apartments. They've done phenomenally well. But the truth is, that piece of property was so key. It should have been a mixed-use development. It should have been office. It should have been a little retail. It should have been apartments. But I never will forget that Chairman Lee basically says, "Don't file a suit." At that time, I guess he was working with the Braves, and I didn't know it. But he says, "Don't file a suit. I know you have reason to file one, but don't do it." I said, "Well, give us all apartments. We'll go build all apartments." And he says, "Done." But I've always felt like that was underbuilding and under-designing that location.
Well, what we did, John, is we hire a group at Georgia Tech, economists, who we've developed a process that the school board will accept. And if it passes positive, then the school board's going to be kept whole. And they've accepted it, so it's far more automatic now than it was before. So when you get ready to do that, let me know.
Well, it's coming.
Okay, well, just let me know.
We'll do.
And we'll lay the groundwork for it. So
And our goal in all candor would to be the best building, build a absolutely A++ building.
we know we just financed Tyler Perry's airplane. I guess you saw.
Yeah, I saw that up in. He
McCullough.
keeps it in McCullough.
McCullough. He's got two. That's a 70 passenger. He has a 50 passenger plane. And you know, this day and time for a development authority to own an airplane, we've come a long way.
Pretty interesting.
Yeah, we've come a long
Well,
way.
we want, but I'd like to, you know, you talk about dreaming. Cobb County needs a really first-rate hotel. I'm talking about an A+ hotel, and somebody needs to take the lead in making that happen. There'd be several locations you could put it. And you know, Jim has this crazy idea about, and it might not be so crazy. Maybe somebody ought to study to whether his idea really has legs. But
Where would you build it?
well,
Got a site.
yeah, the site is already owned by the Cobb Exhibit Hall Authority, where the hold is and all.
Right, where exactly
And
it is.
why they would sell that property is beyond. You know, property is so precious.
Right.
They should never sell that piece of property.
Can I tell you a secret?
Yeah.
I'm right in the middle right now working on a deal that may be one of the biggest things we've done in Cobb County in a long time. The runway at Dobbins is a restricted runway. Buddy Darden passed a piece of legislation in 1988 that restricted that runway to Lockheed's use and the Department of Defense only. It's the only DoD airfield in the world that has that restriction. Well, fast forward, Lockheed has got to downsize, and what it wants to do is to move everything on the South Campus to the North Campus and sell the entire South Campus, which is almost 100 acres of land. And they'll be able to do that if we get the runway reclassified as a joint use. And before I retire at the end of this year, that's going to happen.
Yeah, that'd be a great deal.
Right smack dab in that location with a 10,000-foot runway, 5 minutes from soccer field, 5 minutes from the Braves Stadium, and that sort of thing. You could build a building as Well, the restriction would be about 20 stories, about as high as you can do, but you got close to 100 acres sitting right there.
Yeah, sure.
So that's,
No, well,
yeah, that's,
the other, were you part of the trip that went out to Dallas to see what the Cowboys are doing
Yeah.
around there?
Yeah.
I've almost, you know, I did everything. I almost, Arthur was gonna put that soccer over in DeKalb County,
oh, I'm,
and then he found out there might be some problems with environmental.
Yeah.
And I was talking with him, and I said, Arthur, you don't need to go there. Don't do it. Go up, and so actually, both Mayor Tumlin, and Lee, I set up an appointment for them to go visit because Arthur really didn't think they wanted. So the soccer's there. I think this. Don't put this on me. I think that you could. I think we could move the Falcons practice field to the rest of that property, and you could do hotels and all kinds of. You could turn that thing into beyond belief. I'm still working on it.
when you get ready to do that, you let me know.
Okay,
We'll make it happen.
Jody. I'll tell you when it's going. I'll tell you when I'm gonna beat on him. We done?
Yes, sir. We're done. We're done.